This is part of a kind of 3 different bits of content we're going to do for you. This museum here, beautiful museum, we've been here for 51 years, but we got a grant from Open Space Institute, New York State Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and in December of 2015 we purchased the Dewitt Canal House here in High Falls, a 1797 tavern built by Simeon Depew and his wife Arietta. I will do a tour of that building as part of my Where's Our Historian series. So stay tuned on Facebook, check us out on Instagram, and look at canalmuseum.org, and we'll have links on those platforms to the various content we'll be producing. So we'll have Where's Our Historian, and that'll be me at various sites on the D&H Canal talking about what I'm seeing. The other thing will be the virtual museum. Since this museum will only be here for another 2 years, if we can stay, if COVID doesn't lengthen our timeline. So this is an opportunity. What I'll be doing is a formal tour of this museum. Today I just thought I'd see what this was like, ask some questions, and just walk you around the museum a little bit. Maybe some of you know all about the Delaware and Hudson Canal, but in case you didn't, back in the War of 1812, America had an energy crisis. Do you know it was cheaper to ship coal across the Atlantic Ocean than to ship it by land here in America? That's because we didn't have transportation infrastructure. Think about the Roman roads in England. We didn't have any of that. We had Native American trails, we had rivers which were one way. So, War of 1812, it's more expensive to get Virginia coal to, say, Philadelphia or New York City. Philadelphia was the largest country in America in 1812. New York City surpasses it circa 1820. So we really needed coal. And there were a pair of dry goods merchants by the name of Morris and William Wirtz, good Quakers, had a business in Philadelphia. They got a contract with the U.S. government to give them uniforms for the war effort. At that point in time, America had more land than money. Sound familiar? It's probably true today. So as a consequence, Morris and Williams got coal-bearing land in the Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys of northeastern Pennsylvania. And then they set out to try and develop it. And what they were trying to develop was anthracite, stone coal. So this isn't the stuff they had over in England. Bituminous coal is the more common coal. It's softer, it burns easier. So they had a couple things. Blacksmiths in Philadelphia loved this stuff and knew that it actually made a superior, it burned longer and hotter. So if you were a blacksmith in Philadelphia and before the Revolutionary War, you would fire up a big hardwood fire before you could add your coal. You also had to make sure there was enough oxygen around it. But the blacksmiths knew once they got this going, they could go all day long. When they were just burning hardwood, halfway through their 14-hour, 18-hour days, they'd have to stop and start a new fire. They loved the stuff. It actually carbonized the product. It made something closer to steel, unbeknownst to them at the time. But the general public had to learn how to burn this stuff. Any questions yet, Dave?
No, I've not come across any questions.
Yep.
People like it here.
Well, there you go. Hey, if they're out there, just let us know. It's awful lonely.
No, there's people. There's people. I see.
Well, this is all new to me. By the way, too, folks, if there's anything you'd like me to talk about in future series or things you might think would be fun, please either info@canalmuseum.org or put it up on our page. Send us a messenger text. So the brothers, they mined some coal. You know how they had to move this stuff at the time? They'd have to build what they called an ark or a raft. They might take a raft of logs that they wanted to get to market, and they would put the coal on the raft, and then they'd run it down the river in the spring when there was enough water, during what they call a freshet. Famously, the first raft load of D&H coal foundered a mile from where they started. This would have been on the Lackawaxen Creek, and they actually sold it. Well, you're not going to have that kind of luck very often, especially since there weren't a lot of people living there. To this day, I wonder who they sold it to. But at any rate, once you've successfully got your load of coal down to say, Philadelphia, like the brothers did early on, you would then hopefully sell the coal. And of course, initially, people didn't know you could burn this stuff. There's stories of people getting this beautiful coal, not being able to burn it, and just lining the streets of their paths with it. It'd make a pretty nice pathway if you like black, wouldn't it? But the brothers, once they got their coal to Philadelphia, found out their transportation costs were such they couldn't compete with the coal that was coming from the Lehigh Valley and the Schuylkill Valley. So what they do, being great American capitalists, they said, let's build a canal. People said that America had Canal Fever in the first half of the 19th century. Well, canals were the most efficacious way for us to make transportation infrastructure in our young nation. Roads cost more, railroads were in their infancy. The canal was the way to go. And when the Erie Canal opened in 1823, it really showed the way. So there was a long development time. The War of 1812, the brothers get this coal. They start mining it by the middle of the teens, the 18 teens. But it's not until the early 1820s that they start really getting serious. They get permission from the state of Pennsylvania to improve the navigation on the Lackawaxen Creek, to clear out boulders, to put locks if they needed them around falls, to make it so they could move product on the Lackawaxen Creek. Fortunately, there were actually 4 Wirtz brothers. There was Charles and John. John was a Pennsylvania state legislator. It helps when your brother's in the legislative, people. He also served in Congress, and he was the 3rd and most successful. He was the first D&H president to bring them to success, starting in 1830. And he actually, just a little sideline on John Wirtz, by 1850, he's worked so hard that he's ill on the strength of it, and the company gives him a 1.5 years paid leave to go to Europe. And the rest of the officers ran the company in that time. So successful was John Wirtz. The Wirtz brothers were visionaries. They were also good Quakers, and there's things about the D&H Canal that will relate to that as I go along the story. Because of the success of the Erie Canal, well, let's step back for a minute. You want to build a canal, right? Where do you get a degree in civil engineering? West Point was opened in I think it was 02 under Thomas Jefferson. But West Point was really for military engineering, not really civil engineering of the sort. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, my father's alma mater, opened in 1823. But in fact, the very first civil engineering degree given in the United States was given by Union College in Schenectady in 1844. By that time, the canal era of America was pretty full-blown. So the Erie Canal was the training ground for civil engineers in early American history. And there's some people that we'll talk about as the story goes on. So I've got my wife here. My lovely little wife, Kelly, is my camera person, and she's giving me little hand signals. We probably should, that's moving along. Huh? Okay, darling, got it, yeah. So let's take a minute. So the Erie Canal, we have this wonderful painting. This is probably by Ezra Ames, an Albany, New York area limner, an untrained sort of folk painter, but this is a pretty good painting, and he actually was a very good painter. But this is Dewitt Clinton, the father of the Erie Canal. You know, Dewitt Clinton went to Thomas Jefferson, tried to get the federal government to fund what became the Erie Canal. Jefferson said, at first he was excited by the idea, but then he said, you know what, it'll be a century before we'll have the know-how to do this. You know, I love Tom Jefferson, but that's the 3rd instance of severe cognitive dissonance that I know about the man. But here we've got Dewitt Clinton, presumably when he's governor of New York State. In fact, there's a picture of his uncle, George Clinton, famous American, with the exact same composition as this. I love this. If this is Albany, you Albany folk, I don't think the Hudson River, there's no mountains up near Albany that look like this. Hey, artistic license, folks. And here he's holding the act to incorporate the D&H Canal Company. This particular painting hung at the Governor Clinton Hotel. Yeah, the gimbal isn't really working anymore. Ran in the Governor Clinton Hotel and was donated to us by the Ulster County Bar Association many, many moons ago. So because of the success of the Erie, eventually DeWitt Clinton finds the state has to finance this. It was called Clinton's Ditch and Clinton's Folly. Well, you know, the joke was on them because in its very first year of operation, the tolls more than paid the debt service. the main line of the Erie Canal made nothing but money for the state of New York. The fact that the state had financed it meant that all these communities in the state needed feeder canals, most of which didn't make money, but the state felt like they had to do it. And most of the canals, I don't have a number on this, but most of the canals during the era of Canal Fever in America, the first half to two-thirds of the 19th century, were financed largely by states. The federal government didn't fund but one or two. I'm sure there's people out there that might correct me. That's okay. I need correction too. And most of them were state. The D&H was one of two privately funded. So the D&H Canal, I'm going to run all around the museum because we've got stuff in funny places. But these are some important people, and since I'm showing you around the museum here today, Happy Easter, by the way, and Passover for my friends. Benjamin Wright was the chief engineer of the Erie Canal. Men that worked with him, James McEntee, Western New York, Scots-Irish, his family, I think his father came over from Ireland, Irish Protestant. James McEntee started working under him. John B. Jervis. John Jervis, 19-year-old farm boy, gets a summer job working as a lineman under Judge Wright. Benjamin Wright was a surveyor. Many surveyors became lawyers in early American history. In the same way that we didn't have civil engineering schools, we didn't actually have law schools yet. And you studied law. Very often surveyors became lawyers because they had to defend the surveys they did in court. So you became a lawyer. Judge Wright was one of those men. John B. Jervis, 19-year-old farm boy, in his dictated autobiography, he talks about just shutting up and listening. But in fact, actually, he was a brilliant man who studied as well. John Jervis went on to do one of the Hudson River railroads, and he also invented the railroad truck. Any of you folks know what a railroad truck is? Think about a rail car, right? You got a car, it's 50 foot long. If you've got 4 wheels, that's really going to severely limit how tight a turn that railroad car can go. John Jervis had the simple but brilliant idea that if you put a truck of 4 wheels, say 6 foot by whatever the width of the tracks were, and they were variable in early American, and another one in the back, now that thing could take much tighter turns than before. But John Jervis became lauded by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And then we've got John Roebling, but I'm going to come back to him a little later on here. So back over this way. So here it is, you know you've got to build a canal, right? So you knew you got to hire somebody. Well, the D&H, they go to the top. They hire Judge Wright. And he's already so busy. Anybody wanting to dig a ditch in America? Hire this man. He's already so busy that 2 men under his supervision, it was John Sullivan and Dave, do you remember the other guy's name?
I think it was Mills.
Yes, Mills, thank you. Men more lost to history after this. Yeah, right? But the actual surveying was done by them. If you come this way, I'll talk about the route they decided to, that he recommended. They started on the side of the, so here, if you're going to build a canal, you end up building in river valleys, almost exclusively. Well, you need a source of water, and indeed, anytime the canal dropped below the level of the water, there were feeders that would then divert water into the canal. I like to say anytime you have water higher than the canal, you figured out a way to get it in the canal. But the other thing, think about it, in the river valley, you're going to go the longest stretch without needing a lock. A lock is a device to overcome changes in elevation. Most of them would lift a boat or lower a boat 10 foot. The D&H, that was pretty much the average, with some exceptions I won't get into here. So think about it, you can find the longest stretch at the same level so that you would need less locks. The Erie Canal, famously, the Mohawk River Valley was really, the Appalachian Mountains were a real barrier to settlement in early American history. So everything east of the Appalachians was clear-cut. This is, oh, your live video has ended. But it hasn't, has it?
No, you're fine.
Yeah, never listen to your laptop, people. It did for a minute, though, didn't it? That's what it was. So there you are. You're in a river valley. So famously, the Mohawk River Valley was this first spot that nature got to get you through the Appalachians. The Erie Canal's biggest thing, besides keeping trade in America, because otherwise it would have wound up in Canada with the British, and we weren't into that. But the other thing is that it really opened up the West, because it didn't just get you to Buffalo, New York, which really wasn't getting you very far, especially since Buffalo was pretty much a wilderness at that point. It was not that built up. But it got you to the Great Lakes system. It got you to Chicago, didn't it? You know, there weren't a lot of white people, non-natives, west of Chicago in, say, 1812, 1815. Some crazy French-Canadian fur trappers, and that was about it. But the Mohawk River Valley, 385 miles, and it was 65 locks. No, 365 miles, 85 locks. I don't have my Erie numbers memorized like I do the D&H numbers. But the D&H, the route that Judge Wright and his the people under him, his supervised engineers, decided was to follow the Lackawaxen River at a town that had been known as the Forks of Dyeberry, but was named after the first D&H president, the famous New York City diarist Philip Hone. Starting in Honesdale, it followed the Lackawaxen Creek to the confluence of the Lackawaxen and the Delaware. There it crossed, early on it had what was called the Delaware Pond. They put up a dam, and they had a rope ferry. The earliest boats had a single animal. You put the animal on the boat, you pulled yourself across the Delaware Pond. Later they changed that, but that's later in my story. Once you cross the Delaware, it followed the Delaware River. You know, originally they were just going to run it in the Delaware. I walk along there and I, for the life of me, can't figure out how they thought they'd do that. But in the end, they immediately realized they had to build a canal all along the Delaware River. Down at the town of Port Jervis, named for John Jervis. It was known as Carpenter's Point prior to that. Port Jervis had started following the Neversink River, past the Bashakill, runs up onto the Sandberg Creek. Here in Ellenville, runs in, starts to follow the Rondout Creek, and it followed the Rondout Creek all the way to the town of Rondout, Kingston, New York, on the Hudson River. They're still 80 miles from their intended market. But topography is king, as I always like to say. You have the Shawangunk Mountains stretching all the way here. Interestingly enough, in 1825 or 24, when this route was announced, the town fathers of Newburgh, way over here, petitioned the D&H Company to actually terminate their canal there. And they actually sent Jervis to go and do a preliminary survey, but I gotta think they were just trying to get their money. And I'll get to that in a second. Nobody actually tunnels through the Shawangunk Mountains until one of the railroads does in, I believe, 1872. And we've got to really, since you're getting a tour of the museum, this is a first look because this isn't even on display yet. But this is something I found on one of those online auctions. By the way, if you see a merchant base, you're bidding against them, and you really care and you want to see these things go to a museum, don't bid against me. Thank you. But this is a map. This was published in 1823 or 4. It says on the right-hand side there. This is the map that the D&H made to get investors interested. So Wright suggests this canal. He says it's going to have 110 locks, and he says it's going to cost $1.3 million. This is some $30 million in today's spending power. This map was put out to get investors, because who had that kind of money lying around, huh? This will be probably prominently featured in the new museum we're currently working on that'll open at the Depew Canal House, hopefully in 2022, gang? We'll see. So, that's a lot of money. How do you go about finding money? Well, coffee houses. Coffee houses in early American life, European life for that matter too, were places where men of means, people who had money, would find investment opportunities. So if you had a harebrained scheme or even a good one and you needed money, you might go to a coffee house. Here we've got, let's see, move on. This is the Tontine Coffee House on Wall Street. The Tontine was a prominent spot for financiers to look for investment opportunities. It's no accident that Wall Street today is still the center of the financial services industry. It started with the Tontine. So the Tontine Coffee House, on a cold January day, it was January 7th, 1825, the now recently formed, what is it? It was the something or other matter. It's a big long name. I have to go look it up. But they started a canal company. It quickly gets taken over by New York people. Well, New York is the primary market. We're now at a point where New York's the biggest city in the world, or excuse me, in America. Kind of destined by topography and geography to become the center. It did become it, wasn't it? But they needed investors, they needed money, and it was all New York people who pretty much, in fact, they opened on this day, January 7th, they opened the stock books. And they sell out by 2 o'clock. They've oversubscribed the entire offering. They also opened stock, they opened the books in Kingston Bank and in Goshen, but most of this money came from New York City. And so with that, they're ready to go. They actually asked for $1.5 million. They had the right to take, I believe it was $500,000 of that and use it for banking, and that was a common thing before the United States had its own currency. And very often these newly formed companies would get the right to form a bank so that they could get some stockholder value. So there's a way to make money when pretty much they're just spending the money to dig a canal. So they're off and running. You have to pay 10% down. They had the money to start, and they start working. On July 13th, 1825, they break ground in Rome, New York, what we now know as Mamakating near Wirtsboro. Wirtsboro, New York, actually named for the Wirtz brothers. Those of you in New York State might notice, too, by the way, that a lot of this route between Fort Jervis all the way up to High Falls or thereabouts runs along Route 209, the old mine road, and it was actually on the not only an Indian trail, but according to Evan Pritchard, it was a mastodon route. But I don't want to digress too far. But if we could talk about that some other time. But that's the route. And so numerous contractors started digging, and it was typically you started digging in the easy spots first. But they have, at one point, 2,500 men and 200 teams working on this canal. And they built this entire thing in 2.5 years through largely wilderness. And what did they build? They built a canal that was 32 foot wide on the top, 20 on the bottom, 4 foot deep. And it was built to accommodate boats that were 75 foot long, 9 foot wide, and could take 30 tons of cargo. And the D&H throughout its entire history was a coal company. They were really one of the earliest integrated companies in American history. They owned mines, they owned a railroad, that I'll talk about in a minute, and of course they built and operated this canal. So off they go. And I'll stop right here for a minute. The canal's being built. They still had to get the coal from the mines. The mines were in a town that very quickly got dubbed Carbondale. I love the imagination of the early names, right? Carbondale, where did they get that? It's hard to see on this map, maybe better, but it's a topographical map. They had 900 foot of elevation of the Moostic Mountains to get over. They talked about trying to do a canal, but how are you going to get a canal up on a mountain? Unless you have like a spring-fed lake like Mohawk maybe, you're not going to have a source of water. So what they ended up doing, John Jervis designed and built the gravity railroad. Why was it a gravity railroad, people? Because they used the weight of the laden cars going down to pull the light cars up. This meant that the thing was designed with all the cars connected. They were originally connected with iron chain, but they had a lot of trouble with that. The chains kept breaking. These cars, 4 tons per car. What do you do when a coal car breaks its chain, right? Dangerous. They did have a brake, but still, it was a very dangerous kind of thing. And they were forced to use hemp rope. In fact, you'll see in the 1830 annual report where they end up having to have some $4,000 for hemp rope. But at least hemp rope lets you know before it's going to break. But remember I mentioned the D&H Canal, these guys were good Quakers? Well, the D&H Canal largely didn't operate on Sunday. They closed down. The canal company, even after all of the Wirtzes are dead, would give property to any church along the run of the canal for them to build churches. So they really encouraged everyone to have a religious life. Kind of apropos here on Easter to talk about that. So on Sunday, that hemp rope, at the end of the day, before midnight on Saturday night, they took down, this was a 17-mile railway, they took out all that hemp rope and then put it back out on Monday morning. Well, the hemp rope didn't last but a season, if that long, and so this was a way to protect their investment. By the 1840s, there's a guy by the name of John Roebling. Since you're over there, dear, we'll point to him for a minute. John Augustus Roebling, German immigrant to America. He comes over and with a bunch of his fellow townsmen, and they're going to start an agricultural community. I think he was going to farm sheep in western Pennsylvania. It ends up not working out, but John had studied engineering in I forget which town now, but it'll come to me. So he was a civil engineer, and people over in there at that time had talked about making rope out of wire. John Roebling actually starts making that wire rope on his farm. In 1844, the D&H starts using his wire rope. In fact, I believe gravity railroads, because the D&H wasn't the only one to have a gravity railroad, were some of the earliest purchasers of wire rope products. And John Roebling comes into the story a little later, but he really sort of saved their bacon. After 1844, some guy doesn't have to go out every Saturday night and take down the ropes. While we're on the subject of the gravity railroad, I should point out one more D&H first. They ran the first steam locomotive in the Western Hemisphere, the Starbridge Lion. These were some of the earliest locomotives. So this was 1828, 1829 in that era in England. In fact, early on the D&H, let me step back a minute. We didn't even have railroad ties yet. The D&H line was hemlock stringers with a half inch by 2 inch iron. Steel doesn't start being made until about 1850, the Bessemeyer process. Iron plating put on hemlock stringers. And they sent a young man by the name of Horatio Allen to purchase these. He had actually already quit working for the canal company because he knew railroads were the next big thing. And a lot of the history books have this wrong. They thought that Horatio was working for the canal company, but there's a letter to the New York Times on the 50th anniversary where Horatio himself sets it straight. He was a young man, canals, nuts to that. Railroads, that's the thing. While he's there, they arranged for the purchase of 4 steam locomotives. These are $3,400 to $4,000 a piece. They take delivery of 2 of them. History is vague on this, and I'm going to try and get to the bottom of it. One of them, so the 2 of them come into New York Harbor, and in 2 consecutive days, they set them up on blocks at foundries in Manhattan, and they just run them. People just come just to watch the wheels turn. That's how important steam technology was at that point in time. This was great new technology, like what the internet probably used to seem like. So, but I love the idea that they set it up on blocks and people came all around just to watch the wheels turn. All right. The America exploded. At this point in the story, I always want to stop and say, things that seem really obvious aren't. The pressure relief valve was not invented until sometime in the 1850s, and prior to that, steam engines would explode promiscuously. In the early steamboat era in the Hudson River, they had things called safety barges. Barges with no motive power that were pulled behind steamboats, so if something hit the fan on the steamboat, you were safe in the safety barge. So the America turns into shrapnel, but the Starbridge Lion is put on the tracks, and they run it on August 8th of 1829. And Horatio, not even working for the canal company anymore, but he says, I'm going to operate this. I'll be responsible. And he takes it there and back, but it's creaking. Well, Jervis had designed the tracks and all of this stuff to carry 5 tons. Well, the Starbridge Lion hit the tracks at 7 tons. History, once again, doesn't tell us what that was all about. There's a lot of speculation. So I'm going to speculate. It's my contention that the Starbridge Lion was 5 tons in Starbridge, but 7 tons in Homestead. And why is that, you would say? Any guesses? Should we give him a minute, Dave? We'll see if anybody's there. By the way, this will probably be put up, I think, so that people will be able to watch this.
Chester's there.
What's that?
Chester's there.
No. Okay, so, any guesses, Dave? Or? Nope. So, it's my contention that it was the imperial system. And I did a little research. Even then as now, we don't all have the same measurement systems. A ton was heavier in England than it was in America. And so I think that's where the misunderstanding came. Unless some of you out there are going, oh, come on. I'll point out that the Hubble Space Telescope had a similar problem. It wasn't weight, it was length. But something was made metric that should have been inches or vice versa, and they didn't discover it till the darn thing was up all the way in space, and they had to send a whole new space shuttle crew up just to repair that one problem. So take it for what it's worth. I'm working on a book. This is the story I'll tell. I will also tell you it's speculation. But I may still get to the bottom of that someday. There's still letters to read and things to do. So now they've got a means between this two-tiered transportation system, really three-tiered, because they wanted the boats to go out on the Hudson River, but those 75-foot boats were not adequate to traverse the tidal estuary that is the Hudson River. So they were and there are early letters that you could tell they wanted to just take the boats out on the Hudson. But in fact, they had to offload the coal onto the docks and into bigger barges that were then pulled by steamboats down the Hudson River to New York City. And of course, we don't have any of the boats, but we do have pictures. And by the way, all the pictures you're going to see are largely post-Civil War. Photography doesn't really take off until that era. Someday I'll figure out the earliest picture I have. Certainly nothing earlier than the 1850s, and it's my feeling that probably the Civil War, 1860 on. And so, as a consequence, we only have pictures of boats from the final enlargement. So the D&H, they got their canal running, they're moving their coal, they're selling it. At first, they're mining surface coal, and they get a bad reputation. So it takes them a while to get the public to where they trust them. But by the 1840s, after a decade of operating, they start to have some success. I think 1840 is the first year that most historians think they started really kind of coming into their own and making some money. There's a great story that early in their days, Philip Hone is their president for the very first year, but then he gets elected mayor of New York at a time in American politics where it was considered gauche to run for office. Your friends would say, Philip Hone, he's the guy, but it would be, Philip wouldn't go, I'm running for mayor. At any rate, he gets elected mayor, and he feels like it's a conflict of interest, and so he remains on the board, but he retires as president, a guy by the name of John Bolton, a character that people didn't seem to like, so you get the feeling he wasn't the nicest guy. But he's not very successful either. John Wirtz takes over in 1833, I believe, but don't hold me to that one. But Hone, very early on, there's a story, and I thought it was apocryphal until I found a newspaper account of it in the middle of the 19th century. At one point in time, this young company, they're not making money, they've got a reputation, their coal isn't selling like they'd like it, there's a lot of competition, and for want of $10,000, they're going to go under. And every story says the same thing. They said Philip Hone goes home, and he thinks about all the widows and orphans that had invested their money in DNA. And I'm scratching my head every time going, how many widows and orphans are playing the market? Boy, was America that much different? But in any event, Philip Hone loans the $10,000 to the company and saves the entire thing. So the D&H almost wasn't. And the D&H was really important. The reason I'm so excited about this story is that it really had an outside effect on our growing nation. We were a smaller country. Really, everything east of the Appalachians was you got over the Appalachians, you were in no man's land. There was Spaniards over there. There was the French over there. The English after depending on where you're talking about. The D&H was very important, and it really fueled the growth of New York City and the nation as a whole. And that's why it's an important American story. So the D&H is finally so successful that they start enlarging their canal. Gee, you want to carry more weight? What do? Make it deeper. And indeed, that's what they do. I believe 1843, they increase it by a foot. So now instead of being 4 foot deep, it's 5 foot deep. They're so happy. Now they're making the boats, they do what they call hipping. They're putting boards on the side of it so they can load more coal in there. And they increase their tonnage. Eventually, throughout the 1840s, they get up to about 80 tons capacity. And they make the canal deeper simply by building up the towpath side. You just add some more, you add more water, and there you go. But in the 1840s, a number of things transpire to where they want to go big or go home. It's a real American thing again, isn't it? And they undertake the final enlargement. It really starts in about 1847 when they hire John Augustus Roebling to build 2 aqueducts to get them across the Delaware River. They build one across the Lackawaxen Creek and one across the Delaware. Why wouldn't they just build one? The guy who owned the confluence hated the D&H company. This is a time when corporations, even then, were considered sort of behemoths that didn't have our best interests necessarily at heart. And we find the D&H company and all of their annual reports in the first 30 years go to great lengths to tell you all the other goods and services that they foster. And all I can think is that was just public relations people. Yeah, we're a coal company. About 90% of the traffic in the D&H Canal was coal. But there was an awful lot of other goods, and they really wanted people to know that they were a net benefit. So the man who owned the Confluence wouldn't sell to the D&H. They didn't care. I think it was some 40,000. I'll get those numbers wrong, too. They built 2 aqueducts, one over the Lackawaxen Creek, one over the Delaware. The one over the Delaware is still extant to this day. I'll be doing a Where's Our Historian on that site sometime this spring. You can drive it. It's now a highway bridge. The other 3, well, he builds the 2 down there, and starting in 1847. They couldn't be happier. There were some 10 days in one season where they couldn't get across the Delaware because of the water. Now they don't have that problem. Also, the guys who ran lumber for generations down the Delaware thought of it as their river. And so they were constantly throughout their entire run paying for perceived and real damages that some of these people, some of the lumbermen encountered. So once they got up off of the Delaware with these aqueducts, they couldn't be happier, despite the rather high cost. And then in 1850, he builds one right here in High Falls across the Rondout Creek, and he builds one down in Cutterbackville across the Neversink. So John Roebling, in fact, there are people that say that John Roebling designed the canal. He didn't. He just designed the wire rope and these 4 aqueducts. These were the precursors to the famous Brooklyn Bridge. During that 1850, so in 1850, the enlargement, they're now going to make this canal. Let me put it aside. I should point out all of the locks, all of the bridges, and all of the aqueducts. Why did you need aqueducts? You couldn't just let your water run out into a creek. You're going to lose it. It's hard won. You needed aqueducts for the boats in the water to go across the creeks. And we'll show you a model of one maybe a little later in here. All of those were one-way traffic. The canal itself was wide enough for 2-way traffic. You had laden boats going up the canal, they called it, to Rondout, and then going back down empty to pick up more coal. Any questions now, Dave? You know, what's that? Lonely.
There was
You know,
one.
I've given this tour in some version or other 1,000 times, but it's fun to do it for the people.
Bob had a question.
That's right, you know. And so by this at this point in time, chime in any time, David, if you can. That's always the challenge with me. Yeah. So here we are, final enlargement. Yeah. So what now has to happen? They're going to make the canal wider, because they're going to accommodate boats now that are 91 foot wide and 91 foot long, 14.5 foot wide. So everything has to be rebuilt. It has to be widened, although in some places they couldn't widen it, they simply squared it up. So 32 foot wide, you can still pass 2 14.5 foot boats, just barely. But most of the time, 40 to 50 foot wide. They had to rebuild all 110 locks. Well, wait a minute. In the end, they dropped down now to 108 locks. So the original route was 108 miles long with 110 locks. In the final enlargement here in High Falls, the route was so serpentine, they couldn't use the original route. They had to cut through what they called the deep cut in High Falls. And if you ever manage in the summer, when hopefully we can all congregate a little more, I can take you on a tour of the 5 locks walk, and I can point and show you how much dirt they had to dig out. So here in High Falls, all our locks, they lost 2 locks. So the locks on the 5 locks walk, a National Historic Landmark, have 12 to 12.5 foot of lift, where most of them have 10 foot of lift. You might question too why we know these things. In 1854, the canal company, Russell Farnham Lord, chief engineer from sometime in the 1830s till 1867, works for the company until he dies he's chief engineer till 61, 62. He stays on as a consulting engineer until he dies in 67. But he had maps of the route of the canal made, and they're beautiful. Sometime I'll show you the reservoir map that we have in our collection. They're 2 foot by 3 foot, hand-colored. Well, they wound up in an archive up in Canada, Expo Rail, because the D&H company turned into a railroad that was then bought by Canadian Pacific, and everything went up into Canada. The DHTHC managed to we couldn't get them to give us the maps. We can't understand why they want maps in a New York, Pennsylvania canal in Canada. But there you have it. Fortunately, though, we have wonderful 300 DPI scans, high-resolution scans, of all of these huge maps, and they're a godsend. I'm learning more about the canal with these maps. So I can say definitively what every lock, because it's notated on these maps. They're fascinating. We have a very severe license, but here's an incentive to come and visit us. If you come when I'm here, and certainly probably my docents too, we can show you those maps. We can't let you take pictures of them, we can't give you a copy of them, but I can show them to you. In our new museum, hopefully to open in 2 years, we probably will feature some of them. We are allowed to at least do that. So the D&H, the final enlargement, starts in 1847 with those aqueducts down south, but they don't really widen. They don't start carrying those bigger boats until 1850. And so the boats that we see and the things you'll see around the canal, this is all working up, believe it or not, the last 5 minutes, to this. I told you I'm trying to show you around the museum, right? This is a feed box. It's not usually open like this. We're collections storage. It's neat the way they make these so that this is a flat bench, or almost flat bench. I've seen 2 or 3 of these. This was a feed bin for the mules. But these bigger boats had to have 2 mules. The D&H really preferred mules to horses because they worked longer and harder on less feed, and because they actually just would work until they dropped. You know, if you had a horse and it went lame, you got to pay somebody to feed it, and you can't even use it. So here's a feed bin, and now any of these pictures you're going to see are of those much longer boats. And right here we've got nighthawks. The rules of engagement in the D&H Canal, you had to have lights at night. There were many eras on the D&H when they ran 24 hours. I do start to read in the 1870s, they actually make the canalers stop for 4 to 6 hours to give the animals a rest. They actually have Humane Society people who go up and down the canal to make sure you don't mistreat your animals. The D&H also hired chaplains. And the only reason I know that is because there's a obituary of a man who was employed as a chaplain on the D&H. This is how far they went to promote family values. Hard to find a company that would do that today. Huh? And here's just some great pictures of boats in various sections of the canal. You're going to see an awful lot after the Civil War, certainly the last 2 decades. It was really only families that could afford to run these boats. So we got a lot of pictures of people where you'll see children, hoagies. They were the mule drivers. Hoagie for the 2 phrases they use the most. Ho for stop and gi for go. Somebody on Facebook about 6 months ago tried to say it was because those are also the phrases they use for oxen when they're plowing, but it's left and right. But I know for a fact from testimony in a famous court case that the mules knew the towpath. It was 10 foot wide. They didn't need to be told which way to go because they were smart enough to know the towpath. But you really had to be able to have them stop and go when you told them to. By this era, you were supposed to have 3 people employed. And even on the earlier boats, you were supposed to have a mule driver, a bowman, and a captain who steered. But very often these boats would run shorthanded with just 2 people. So in the 1850s, there was a famous court case where another coal company was one of the reasons they enlarged the canal, the PA Coal Company. Funny, because all the officers were D&H people. I think they were trying to start a friendly rival. If so, it didn't work out because they were supposed to help pay for the savings in cost the enlarged canal gave them. Instead, they reneged. They went into an arbitration court case. There was 8 volumes, and they're a boon to historians. Nobody else. The canal company won, but never collected. The other coal company just took their traffic over to the Erie Railroad that had developed in that similar era. But we learned an awful lot about the lives of the canalers from their testimony. So I could say boys as young as 7 years old would start out as hoagies or mule drivers. Early on, they would actually hire them out of orphanages. In fact, a mule in the 1850s might cost you $100. And if a team went in the water, captains were instructed to get the team out first because you could always get another orphan. I'd like to think by the time it was family groups that it depended on the kid, didn't it? Some kids, you save them, other kids, get the mule first. But it's phenomenal. Mules and horses were like cars, and $100 is a year's wages, 2 years' wages for a common laborer. I see in the testimony $1 wages, typical, $1 a day wages, typical for most people. So some of the mule drivers would work for $6 or $7 a month, and they're walking, 14, 16, 18, 24 hours sometimes a day. And very often, too, they didn't get paid, especially if they weren't family. It was a tough life, but if they were lucky, they worked up to boatsman and then to captain. And I have numerous stories of canalers that started on the canal at 7 and were in charge of a whole boat at the age of 14. Childhood's a 20th century invention. You had large families, and of course, you lost a lot of your children. Medicine being in its infancy. So you had large families because a lot of them would die in your lifetime because you needed workers. So here we have, and you already did. I love that picture of the mule. That's down in Roundout right there. Here in this museum, I'm not sure whether this will make it in our new museum, so this is your chance to see it. This is a mock-up of what the interior of a boat cabin would look like.
Bill, a question.
Oh boy. Yeah?
This is from Robert Seacamp. How many years did the D&H Canal operate?
It opened in 1828, in October 16th of 1828, and it operated along its full length until 1898. But at that point in time, the canal was sold to Samuel Kirkendall, Thomas Cornell's son-in-law and heir, and he operated it from, well, basically it held water from Cutterbackville to Rondout, and he operated it from Wirtsboro to Rondout for a couple years. In 1901, he sells out part of the bed to the New York O&W Railroad, and look for my Where's Our Historian series. You'll see some stuff that I've shot on the New York O&W bed laid over the D&H Canal bed. But it continued, actually, Kirkendall was buying up cement plants. When they were digging the D&H Canal, let me go back for a minute. All this to answer the question, that part of it operated until 1917. But while they were digging the D&H Canal, I'm going to take it back a little further. While they were digging the Erie Canal, a guy by the name of Canvas White discovered natural cement. And he patented it. Everybody violated his patent, but the state of New York gives him $10,000, a huge sum of money. The D&H was going to get that cement, they were going to get Canvas's cement out of Chenango and run it down the Erie, down the Hudson River, and out to where they needed it for their locks and the like. But they were smart. They had a geologist along with the crews, and in the very first season, here in High Falls, in Marbletown, people say Rosendale, it wasn't. People say James McEntee, it wasn't. A geologist discovered by the company discovers this dolomitic limestone that makes the best natural cement. I'll be doing a Where's Our Historian on natural cement in the coming weeks as well. And so the D&H started the Rosendale cement industry. They didn't need to ship that cement. So now we're going to go back. Kirkendall buys the canal. He buys up cement companies at the turn of the 20th century. He's going to corner the market for natural cement. Tough, because Portland cement is starting to supplant it. And in fact, the Portland manufacturers get the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, is it? The ASME standard written in such a way that it favors Portland. Well, contractors like Portland because it dried quicker, but not as good a product. So this canal ran cement, and a lot of the books have got this wrong. I can say definitively from documents in our archives through at least 1916 and probably 1917. And 1917 is the year that one of the big Rosendale cement companies went under. And it's my contention, and I'll do some research in my spare time to sort of nail that down. So the canal operated in some way or other, starting in 1828 until 1917. And this is, as I say, none of the books have got this right, but I'm working on a book now. I hope in the next, it's going to take me as long as it's going to take us to open the museum, isn't it? But because of this court case, there's really a lot of new information. As my colleague, Dr. Powell, the historian and president of the Carbondale Historical Society, written 25 volumes on the Gravity Railroad. He likes to exhort all of us D&H historians to study these books. We're changing the history. I'd add, he also mentions, and I'm certainly, these wonderful, the maps, we call them the Canadian maps, even though they're really Pennsylvania and New York, are really amazing. When we're open in the fall, and I think we might manage, we can't make any promises, come by on one of the historian days, and I'll be happy to show you some of those maps if you're interested. I don't even know how we're doing on time. I figured about an hour. I think my phone will die at a certain point. Any other questions, Dave?
No other questions that I've seen. So for how long did you want to go?
Oh, I don't know. You know me, Dave. So that's a wonderful, Dave.
Has nothing on you.
Thanks. Here is Ben Hendricks at Taylor's Lock, Lock 27, which is now where the granite used to be. Right, it's gone. But here is him sitting at the gear house. That's an interesting story. So all these locks needed 2 lock tenders, one on each side to operate the miter gates. Leonardo da Vinci invented the miter gate in the 16th century. Miter gate was a gate where there's an angle. You can see it actually right here. That the pressure of the water will keep the gate closed. That wouldn't happen if they were in a straight line. They're at an angle, and they're called miter gates. And you'll see on the lock remains where the miter gates have pockets. But the D&H between 1853 and 1857 converted all of their locks to a unique semi-patented system that allowed a single lock tender. And you can see in the extant locks, one of the reasons why I love this history and why I think you'll all love the Where's Our Historian series is there's an awful lot of stuff that you can see in the ground today. And all along this route, there's a lot of publicly accessible stretches of the canal. We're working on, it'll be live in the next month or two, a Google map that's going to show you where you can go and see the canal, where you can park, and what you might, to some degree, see there. There's so much in the ground, so I can look at a lock and tell you which side was before 1853, before 1850, and which was after the enlargement. And there's a really fun story. Well, there's a lot of fun stories. But this unique semi-patented, the Morris Canal used this same scheme. Other canals used other schemes. It never really took hold because even by then, canals were not an anachronism yet, but they were already on the decline because of railroads. And in fact, we talk about packet boats. Packet boats referred to boats that carried packets of mail as well as people. And some people said, no, I'm going to go way over here since I'm talking about packet boats. Isn't that horrible? Because here's a nice picture. In fact, a historian friend of mine and I were discussing this picture. Everybody thinks this is the Erie Canal. There was a PBS special on the Erie. They said it's the Erie. This is an E.L. Henry painting of a packet boat. Edward Lamson Henry was a New York City artist. He had his atelier on 10th Street, but he was also in the Cragsmore, New York artist colony. He was one of the founding members, so he had a summer home up above Ellenville. This painting was taken in Ellenville, but many people mistake it for the Erie. Well, that's an Erie-style packet boat, and nobody's seen pictures of the early packets on the D&H. Well, that's because railroads early on could carry people easier than heavy weight. Canals could still carry weight. Packet boats were slow. They were prevalent, and there's no question the D&H had packet boats. We just don't have pictures of them because by the time photography has ascended, nobody's riding packet boats except for fun, because that traffic is all on railroads. And as I say, there was a controversy. Somebody said, oh, that's the Erie Canal. There's a PBS special. There's a book on this man, and it says definitively that it was the D&H. But I know from looking at it, this looks just like the D&H in the Ellenville area on the thousands of pictures that I've seen. What time is it, Dave, anyways? I have no sense of anything anymore. Dave, I'm losing you.
Bob has a question.
It's almost 3 o'clock.
Oh, so I'm doing my hour. Look at that. Bob has a question, I'm told.
There's a question?
Well, my assistant said...
Bob Booth, tell Dave there's a couple of questions here, lol.
Oh, Bob Booth is pointing out there are some questions in there, Dave. Maybe you're not seeing them. I'd love it. I'm trying to make this as interactive as I can. And so, folks, I'm going to do something like this every week at 2 o'clock for about an hour. If there's things you'd like me to talk about or things you'd like to see, I might do some of my PowerPoint presentations so you can see some of our wonderful pictures. I'm open to suggestions. As I say, I'm also going to start filming a more formal video of this museum because it's going to cease to exist in a couple of years. So we'd like to document it. And I'm also going to do the Where's Our Historian, where I'll be out in the field showing you stuff. And I'm hoping that when things get back to normal, I might be able to do some guided tours of things Beyond just the National Historic Landmark 5 Blocks Walk, I was speaking with members of the Rochester Historic Commission, and in fact took 3 of them in the early days of COVID. We took our chances and went out together. I hiked the entire section with them because they'd like to celebrate their history down there. And I wrote for you Accord area folks, I wrote an article for the Accordion, their local historical magazine, where I give you a guided tour of what it is you see. I can amend that now because I've got those great maps, but it actually is a pretty good tour. We will be getting that up on our website in the next month. Kayla, if you're here, we'll get links to some of the articles I've written. I've got 3 or 4 of them out there. Articles by other D&H scholars. Dr. Powell, we might want something on passenger traffic, that article you sent me recently, if you're here. And this self-guided tour. So if you're interested, you can also just email us at info@canalmuseum.org, and one of us will send you out a copy of the PDF. We'd like to get more of you involved. This is an important story. I also, speaking of more of you involved, fundraising is going to get tough, isn't it? Nobody's coming to the museum. My birthday is on Thursday, and if you're a friend of mine, I'm doing a fundraiser for the D&H. I know it's a little, I'm paid by the D&H, but I'm hoping we can raise a little bit of money, and feel free. We will have a donate button on Facebook, and certainly, I believe our existing platform website, canalmuseum.org, has a donation button, and we are in the midst of creating a new website. The excellent Kayla Altland, who saw that wonderful mule sign that's out on the 5 Blocks Walk? That was designed by Kayla, who works for us remotely. Our staff is a wonderful, hardworking staff. Jack Bronlin, our executive director. Jack went to the Cooperstown Museum Arts program. I think one of the best certainly the best in New York State, if not the country. Jack was the executive director at Historic Huguenot Street in Lyndhurst, and now he's my dear friend and my boss. We've got Jack Bronlin, we've got Kayla Altland, deputy director like myself. Kayla's a killing grant writer, does a lot of our administrative work. It's because of Kayla that I'm full-time here at the museum, just in time for COVID. God bless you, Kayla, I owe you. My goodness. We've got Courtney McNamara, is my curatorial assistant. She'll be doing the editing for our video series, and she's a docent. And then there's Amanda Winters, who's our docent, and she's going to be working on our online store here because the D&H Canal Historical Society is keeping everyone fully employed. And we had resolved to do that even before we found out we might be able to get money for it. And I'm proud that we're doing that. And you can help us support that by donating or giving to my birthday fundraiser. What's that?
Dave.
Oh, Dave, I'm sorry. I meant to, when you do these things, my wife's going, you haven't introduced Dave yet, you idiot. Well, she didn't say that. She's nicer than that. Dave Kine, the voice on the phone, the guy asking the questions, is a trustee here at the Canal Society. He's also on the board of the Century House Historical Society. A couple miles down the road, I'll be doing a Where's Our Historian at that site sometime in the coming weeks. That celebrates the story of Rosendale Cement. But Dave is also the curator of our excellent lecture series, and Dave, we're working remotely, Dave's at his home, miles away from here, and he's giving me the questions. Did we find any more questions there, Dave?
No, I'm still looking at it. I'm not the greatest computer whiz in the world. I'm looking
Bob will just have to come back.
You said, Bob, who had a question?
No, Bob was pointing out there were some questions
No,
on there.
it was Bob's question, I
It was
think.
right. There's Bob's question.
Maybe if Bob's still on, he can rewrite his question.
But I've only found one actual question.
Huh.
Well, but comments. Well, I'll have to.
I feel like it had something to do with the width of something.
Yeah,
Like
it's on the
that.
comment.
Yeah. Anything we need to talk about, or anything that makes you want to? Is there a pithy comment you think we should hear?
It's just the feedback, that's all.
Yeah.
Bob said, great job, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. We'll have to meet in person sometime. I've known Bob virtually for a couple of years now, right?
You weren't, I think Bob met you.
Oh, man, I'm getting older, Dave.
Throw him in now page, but he came in one time, I believe.
You know.
He came with maybe his father, I believe.
Okay. I don't know that I connected him with the historical.
Somebody
Well-
was on from California.
Well, and this is the other great thing about Facebook. We should have done this sooner. People all over the world can learn about the D&H Canal. Everybody should learn about the D&H Canal, people. I think I've done a good hour.
Quick question.
What? Oh, great.
The one that really stumped the hell out of me was, what does National Historic Landmark really mean?
Not enough, Dave. It's there's very little protections.
Couldn't go very far.
Yeah, it's just bragging rights. It's bragging rights. But it's something that's celebrated. It's legally protected in that you can't just go and monkey with it. But it's not, you know, the entire canal is a National Historic Landmark, but they picked out 5 different sections. I never remember all of them. The old D&H offices that now house the Wayne County Historical Society are in Homestead where the loading docks were. The canal at Cuddybackville, where it held water until the Nature Conservancy blew up a dam to save a dwarf mussel they didn't save, and drained water out of a century-long public amenity. And there's a group called Wet the Canal, and I believe Save the Canal, trying to get Orange County to do something with this wonderful historic place, to get the water back in that section. That section was a National Historic Landmark. There's a section between the Peterskill Aqueduct, that'll be another Where's Our Historian piece, all the way down to where the Schoonmakers have their farm, you locals. That was a National Historic Landmark. The 5 Lots Walk and one other. But the DHTHC is in the midst of updating that very early. It was done very early on when the register was created. We're updating. I have a vision, folks. Orange County and Sullivan County own the entire bed. Sullivan County does a wonderful job of keeping them open. Unfortunately, they're closed because of COVID. I was going to do some Where's Our Historian, but that's going to have to wait now until they reopen their parks. Orange County pretty well neglects it, but it's there, and we're trying to get it developed. And I'd love to see a D&H trail from Port Jervis all the way up to to Rosendale, the Empire State Trail System. There's enough pieces in place. I'm working on it. I got 3-4 years. We'll see what we can do. But all you good people out there, we need your help. And we'll talk about that on our webpage and on Facebook as we move forward. But National Historic Landmark, yeah, bragging rights. I know even on buildings it only protects the exteriors, which I think is a shame, but we Americans are really big on our private property rights, and so...
I can't, another one, Bill.
Okay.
Okay, this is from Mark Scheck. Were there any slaves on the canal? Did slaves help dig the canal?
You know, thank you for that, Mark. I got a little stipend from the Community Foundation's Community Fund, I'm going to get it wrong, but basically the Community Foundations of the Hudson Valley to do research into the marginalized populations on the D&H Canal. And so I've been doing research for a whole year, and in fact the stipend's over. I've done a report, but I'm still doing this research. I've got a PowerPoint presentation I've given twice on this subject, and I'm going to do that as one of these Sunday afternoons. I have absolutely I cannot find anything that says black people worked when they were building the canal. It's possible that they did it. The canal was built, slavery in New York State, 1799, they passed a law, a gradual manumission law, that basically meant, because you're not going to just dump children slaves out into the world, who's going to take care of them? The law was designed in such a way that when you got old enough, you were free. It was either 18 or 21, I think 21. So by the time the canal was being built, most of the slaves were free. Nowhere in the record of construction can I find anybody mentioning people of color. Definitely Germans and Irish, they did most of the heavy digging. I can say definitively this canal could not have been built or operated without the Irish. But I can also tell you definitively that Free Blacks newspaper account that says that the very first 3 loafers, a loafer on the D&H Canal had a special meaning. They were the guys that sat around waiting for the boats to come to unload them. They were the guys that unloaded the coal. The very first 3 loafers were all 3 guys named John. Their foreman was also named John. Very common name. And those loafers it was an Irishman, a German, and a black man, and then an American who was their boss. So I can say definitively that black people from the start worked on the canal. There was also a newspaper article about the top captain one season, I won't remember the year, Tony Gallagher, colored, captain of the J.B. Holmes. And there's some other, I'm going to get his name wrong, but there was a captain who would supply an all-black crew, himself and 2, for $33 a month, versus the $40 a white man wanted to operate the boat for a man who was the the constable in Rochester, the town of Rochester. So he bought the boats and hired the crews, but he didn't go out on the canal himself. The canal was a real sort of melting pot and a spot where, you know, sort of capitalism sort of writ small, if you will. People would buy boats and hire crews. The canal company preferred when the guy who owned the boat, because the canal company was having the boats built and then selling it to you, they preferred when the owner was on the boat because they took much better care. And there's a lot of stories about how profane and in some ways reckless and inconsiderate in some instances too these people were. But I have no, I'd love to find it. If it's out there, I will find it. I have no, it's likely, we know down south that slaves were often hired out to dig canals for their owners. So certainly, but here in New York State, because we manumitted as early as we did, I've got to imagine there were black men in the crews, but I have not found any primary source documentation where I can say definitively. Was there any other questions, Dave?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, I think this might be a good point to wrap up. Thank you all for joining me. It's sort of weird and lonely. All I've seen is my wife for the last 3 weeks. I love you, dear. You're beautiful. But hopefully join me. I'll be doing something like this every Sunday at 2 o'clock for the foreseeable future. And keep an eye out for Where's Our Historian and for the D&H Canal Virtual Museum sometime this week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.